As promised, we're back for lecture 17. In this round, we're going to be taking the opposite approach than we did in our previous lecture. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at arguments against helping people in need of famine relief. What? How is that possible? How could anyone feel that way? Well, we'll find out. Today, a couple learning objectives for you. First, I'd like you to be able to define some key terms. The big one for today's class is the tragedy of the commons. This is something that we've previously looked at in a previous class, but we'll be looking at it in much more detail today. Also, I would like you to be able to identify Garrett Hardin's lifeboat ethics argument, and then to explain Harriet Garden's satirical take on, so many typos, on Hardin's argument. And then finally, as we do with most of these lectures, I'd like for you to be able to analyze objections to Garden's argument. So let's jump on in. Part 1, lifeboat ethics. I'd like you to consider the birth rate, meaning the average number of children that each woman has, of the top 5 versus the bottom 5 nations, according to the Human Development Index. That is not being represented here. This is a 2017 map that shows births per 1,000. You can see the key in the bottom left corner. So to give you some perspective, the Norway, 1.7 children per woman. Switzerland, 1.5. Australia, 1.8. Ireland, 1.8. Germany, 1.6. On the other end, the five bottom nations include Niger at 7.0 children per woman, South Sudan, 4.8. The CAR, Central African Republic, 4.8. Chad, 5.8. Burundi, 5.5. So clearly what we're seeing that in these countries that have the lowest birth rates, these happen to be countries in Western Europe, while those that have the highest are some of these are countries in Africa. Now, if we also were to overlay another map that shows the GDP of countries around the world, I think what we'll see is a starking similarity in the map. So take a close look at this map. This is 2017 birth rates, and here is 2017 GDP. So the countries in orange and red are the lowest GDP. So GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. Under $1,000 in some of those, in the red countries in Central Africa, between 1,000 and 5,000 in some of those orange countries, which are also the countries that happen to have the highest birth rates. The areas in this map that are in the teal, the darker teal, have a GDP of $25,000 or more per person. And then, again, look at the similarities between this map and the previous map of birth rates. So we see this correlation that the wealthiest nations per capita, per person, also have some of the lower birth rates around the world. And those countries that have some of the poorest countries per person have some of the highest rates. So clearly, affluence / well-being and birth rate are strongly correlated. Simply put, the very worst off are reproducing much more quickly than the very well off. So our author today, Garrett Hardin, notes, if the people in affluent nations were to feed the poor, what would begin as each affluent individual feeding only one impoverished person would, after 1 generation, 2 generations, result in one person feeding 3, and in 2 generations, one person feeding 9 people. And so he's saying, if we're just looking at every one of us helping another person, as we looked at in Lecture 16, everyone donate $200 to save a starving child, well, that child will grow up to have more children per person than those in other countries. And so one mouth will become 2 mouths, will become 4 mouths, so on and so on. So in short, what Hardin is saying is, if we aid people in impoverished countries, the amount of resources allotted to each person will get smaller and smaller over time. We're talking over years and decades and generations, as the poor populations continue to grow. Basically, Hardin says, if we help the poor, soon we will all be poor. The problem of starvation and overpopulation would just get worse until the poor have eventually depleted everything. And this is the nature of any animal. So Hardin likens the earth to a lifeboat. He says simply, we cannot let everyone on, or else the lifeboat will sink. This is often called the tragedy of the commons. Historically, in many of our first settlements, there was a common grazing area where everyone could let their cows out to graze. It would have worked if everyone only let a few of their cattle onto the land, but people were often greedy, and all started overgrazing the land. Pretty soon, the commons area was useless. The lesson here is that if all the rich countries pooled their excess resources to create a common food bank, the poor people would just deplete it carelessly until the world's food sources was ruined for everyone, and everyone was worse off because of it. So what Hardin is saying is, in his argument, his solution to world poverty is this: we should stop sending aid to poor countries, period. We are only making the problem worse by doing so. Human beings are animals, and like any other animal, overpopulation is best solved naturally when the excess animals die of starvation. This is not a call to abolish generosity. While Hardin's suggestion may seem ungenerous to the present generation, it is very generous to all of the future generations who will benefit if we stop trying to feed starving people, which will just make the problems worse for future generations. If we stop feeding the poor, the problem will resolve itself. So it seems that Hardin's argument appeals to the fact that there would be less total suffering if we let the presently starving people die off than there would be if we just continue to feed them, because this will lead to more starving people in the future. So if we are trying to formalize Hardin's argument, it would look something like this. Premise 1. We ought to minimize the total amount of suffering. This should sound very familiar to those of you who consider yourselves utilitarians. Remember, the utilitarian approach to ethical reasoning suggested that we should try to maximize happiness. And if that was not possible, then we should minimize the amount of unhappiness or suffering or pain. So this is very much in line with the utilitarianist approach. First, we ought to minimize the total amount of suffering. 2, if we feed the poor, this will result in more total suffering than if we just let the poor die. Leading to conclusion number 3, therefore, we ought not feed the poor. Rather, we ought to let them die. Now, in our next video, we're going to be taking a look at a satirical take on Hardin's argument.